Welcome to Shift, a college admissions ACT and SAT podcast for a changing world. I'm Tyler, the founder of Achievable, and we have an affordable ACT course that gives you everything you need to ace your ACT. A full textbook, tons of ACT questions backed by our memory enhancing algorithm, a built-in study planner, and full-length practice exams. You can get a free trial by going to achievable.me, and if you like it, use the code podcast to get 10% off. Now, let's get started. Today, we have got Hamada with us from Right Track Admissions, and really glad to have you back, Hamada, and would love if you could just quickly introduce yourself and your company.
Thank you for having me back, Tyler. My name is Hamada Zahawi. I am the founder and CEO of Right Track Admissions, a global admissions consulting company that's been around since 2008, helping college and graduate applicants applying to schools all across the world, from clients all across the world, through the whole admissions process, from school selection to school acceptance and everything in between.
Fantastic. So today, we're going to be talking about how to get the most impactful recommendation letter, and also just kind of digging in a little bit on like what are the types of letters of support that you can get for for your application. So why don't we start with just taking it from the top, right? I mean, one of the things that we talked about when we were preparing for this episode was how there are different types of recommenders, which is something that I actually, we've had a couple people talk about recommendation letters before, but I think this is a new angle for us. So I'm really excited to dig into it with you.
Cool. So basically, we can start with kind of selecting the right recommender, the different types of recommenders. Then what I kind of want to do is follow it up with what you should be looking for. And actually, if you don't mind, I want to
Hmm.
flip it. I want to
Yeah,
start with helping our listeners figure out identifying types, like identifying recommender qualities.
yeah,
Once you recommend
absolutely.
what, once you have that, use that as your lens to then zero in. Because Tyler, if I think that you and I are great friends, you've supervised my work, but then you don't have the qualities that I need as a good recommender, then as great as you are, you're not going to be the person I should be seeking. So you want to make sure that you use these kind of identifiers as your lens, and then go to figure out which recommenders make the most sense in terms of the types that you mentioned. And then finally, kind of what are the best practices for the letter, actually. So now that you've figured out the qualities, you figured out who the best person is, now you want to tell that best person or help guide them with the best practices to ensure that the letter that you get at the end is absolutely spot on.
Fantastic. Yeah,
All
so
right.
let's take it from the top then.
All right. So basically, and I think this is the way that we've approached it, is what are the identifiers? What are the key qualities that you're looking for in a good recommendation letter? Well, first of all, you want to find someone who's, a great cheerleader for you. I think above all else. And linked with that, people come to me and they say, "Hey, listen, I can get a letter of recommendation from the head of the department, or excuse me, a principal, or the head of the history professors at their high school, from all the professors,
Uh-huh.
or someone who's just like the head of a company, let's just say, right?" I'll say, "Well, how well do you know them?" "Well, I don't know them very well, but I know that they have a great title." Okay, that's not going to be helpful, because what you're going to end up getting is a very generic letter. So I would rather you go after someone that knows you very well, that's a massive cheerleader, rather than someone who's just a VIP, like a very important person that people may say, "Ooh, that's nice. You got the principal to write your letter of rec," but they don't know you at all. And so, what was the point?
Right. Yeah. And I mean, I think like the biggest thing, and this advice I heard echoed a couple of times, you really can't like one time I think there's a story in another episode where somebody actually got a letter of recommendation from Al Gore,
Mhm.
but it was like, I am Al Gore, vice president, and I recommend this person. And so it was useless, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. And I have an example. It's exactly the way I was thinking about it. In this person's case, the person that she had got a letter from was a former Secretary of State, but that Secretary of State was a professor at her undergraduate college. So he still taught her. The letter was lukewarm, but it was a Secretary of State, and at least he taught her, so he provided some of the important qualities. What the example you
Hmm.
mentioned is is fantastic. Hamada Zahawi, Vice President of the United States, and I endorse this high school student, and it's a wrap. What was the point?
Right.
You
There
know,
was no benefit from that, basically.
exactly. So, if anything, it just shows that maybe your parents are connected, but that's pretty much it. Um, the other quality that we look for, other than someone who's a massive cheerleader for you, is someone who's, if ideally, familiar with the college admissions process. If there's somebody who's so far removed, so um, again, maybe like an Al Gore hasn't gone to college in 30 plus 40 years, whatever it was, um, he may not be familiar with what is going on in the college admissions space and what colleges are looking for today rather than 40 years ago, right? So ideally, somebody who's familiar with the college admissions process is good, or flexible enough to understand what it is, right? At least has a remote finger on the pulse. I think is ideal. In that vein, someone who's accessible, and that's very important, right? You want to ensure that the recommender is accessible and reliable because you want to make sure that when you ask them, they deliver it on time. I cannot tell you
Yep.
how many clients I've worked with, or former, or people that came before we actually started working together, who we identified a great recommender. They talked to the recommender. The recommender gave them a thumbs up that they do it, and then after the deadline, the recommender writes to them and say, "Hey, by the way, when was this due?" And you're like, "Are you kidding me? I thought you already had submitted it." So
Right.
you want to make sure the person's accessible. That's the ones that's not reliable. In terms of accessibility, you email them 10 times, they say yes, you keep emailing them to follow up or what have you, they never write it. They're not accessible, don't bother. It's just going to drive you nuts. Go for someone else than someone who's not accessible and not reliable.
Well, and also, I mean, this happened to me actually when I was applying to college. Luckily, I got in early decision, so it was not a big deal. But like, if they forget, then you not only do you not have like a recommendation letter from them, but you've also kind of wasted the slot that you would have given to somebody else.
100%. You only have in some instances two, some instances three slots. So you don't want to be in a position exactly like you said, Tyler, where you kind of destroy that chance to have someone write a fantastic letter about you, only because you thought that they are going to have your back. And maybe they did on paper, but when it came to reality, they never ended up submitting it because they got overwhelmed. They're not accessible. They're not reliable. Um, and then that leads me to the last point, which is someone who writes well. There's no point of having someone who's got your back, is a great cheerleader, is accessible, and they just write really bad, like just bad writing, bad scholarship. So there's like exactly like and not that Al Gore's not a great writer, he's a phenomenal writer, I'm sure. But if you wrote, I endorse his candidate, period. Or in this case, they write something, but that's so sloppy, it's just a disaster. In other cases, let me say this for some of the international listeners out there, you may be getting recommendation letters from people whose English is not their first language,
Hmm.
or they don't speak English, period. The idea here is if you cannot find anyone else but that person, I recommend getting it translated by a very good translator.
Yeah.
Knowing that also, yeah, I think, and Taylor, you may want to correct me if I'm wrong, you may have to notarize it or at least have that translator send the letter back to the recommender and the recommender uploads it as if it's their own.
I
You
think
don't
it's
want
the
to be in a
latter.
position,
Yeah.
yeah, you don't want to be in a position of the more removed you are, and this will be, we'll talk about this in the best practices from the letter itself, and waiving any right to view it before it's submitted, the better it is for you because you don't want to be in a position where you tell the school, yeah, I've reviewed it, because then it makes the school feel like maybe you contributed to it or even wrote it yourself. So
Yeah,
if
the
the
school doesn't want you to see it at all. Like that's kind
not
of
at
the
all.
point. Yeah.
Exactly. So the idea is that if you do have to get it translated, have the figure out a way where the recommender sends a letter to a translator. The translation goes right back to the recommender. Recommender signs it and then submits it, um, so that you don't view it. Ideally, because again,
Hmm.
we don't want the school to feel that you're prejudicing the letter. So those are the key qualities. Again, somebody's a cheerleader, somebody who knows the process, someone's accessible, and someone who writes well. If you get those, you're going to be good to go in terms of those qualities that I said, in terms of finding the right recommender with the qualities that you would need to really make sure that you can ace that process. Um, Now it goes back to your question, your initial question, which is what are the different types of recommenders that you can get? not recommendation letters, but the types of recommenders you can get. And I think these are pretty straightforward, Tyler. I don't think any of them are going to surprise you. The
Mhm.
first, obviously, is the most important, academic. Why? Because you want to flex, or you want to have someone else objectively flex your intellectual aptitude, your IQ. And that really comes down not just to your transcripts, not just to any projects, any publications, right, that flex that, but the recommender that can really showcase how well you did in class, how well you performed on midterms and exams and so forth. So it's important that you get a recommendation from an academic. And I mean teachers or even college counselors are obviously great resources for that. And you want to start developing those relationships with those two individuals, or three individuals, or four individuals. So you have optionality, right? So, history, French, biology, your counselor, get to know them, go to office hours, talk to them after class, perform really well, contribute to class discussions. Because you want to have at least a couple of these as your cheerleaders. And ideally, Taylor, if you can get a recommendation letter from the high school professor in the field that you want to major in, aces, right? Think about that. If I'm applying to history, but I get my letter of recommendation from my biology professor, it doesn't look as good, because the qualities that are required that the person is going to speak about from a history professor's perspective, me as a history major, is going to be a lot more important to the school to know than bio, right? And vice versa. So think about that as well.
Well, it's always just about like trying to get as close as possible to being as relevant as possible, right? Like
Right.
you really it everything that gets you closer to essentially it being like like the absolute best case scenario would be like that the letter of recommendation writer is in the same field as the the program you're applying to in college, is best friends with the people on the admissions committee, and also is like worked with you a lot and is a huge cheerleader of you specifically. Like that's like,
Exactly.
that's like the if you hit all the boxes, right?
Exactly.
But that's like the closer you can get to that, the better.
100%. 100%. Because that's exactly what those letters of recommendation. And there was a recent survey I was looking at, where it showed that 55% of those colleges surveyed said that the letter of recommendation is of moderate to critical importance in your application. So it is a very, very important factor as you go through that process. Um, Other letters of recommendation, extracurricular, right? And that's really where you can kind of have both IQ and EQ demonstrated, right, in the letter. And we're talking about coaches, club advisors, anything, mentors, right?
Mhm.
That really on extracurricular perspective that can speak about both of those character qualities, whether it's your EQ as in your emotional quantum, or IQ in terms of your aptitude in an extracurricular event. Um, the third type would be professional. I know a lot of you may not have a lot of professional experience, whether it's an internship or volunteer experience that has some kind of professional element to it. But if you do, that's also a great letter of recommendation as a second. Remember, your first always has to be academic. Your second, again, could be extracurricular or professional. Ideally, for some majors, they're going to want two letters of recognition that are academic, and maybe the third will be extracurricular or professional. But from a professional perspective, again, they can talk about your IQ, your EQ, how well you work with people, how approachable and personable you are, and then the IQ in terms of how you've contributed to the company, or the initiative, endeavor, whatever that you're involved in with them. And again, you want a recommendation from a supervisor, not a colleague, right?
Mhm.
Not someone who's your equal, and certainly not someone who's like an intern and you are their boss, because then they're going to be afraid to write a bad letter of recommendation, and it can affect the veracity of the letter that they're writing for you. Um, and the last one, I kind of want to put this in there, Tyler. And maybe you can add to it and see what you think about it if I'm off base on this one. Is if you get the opportunity, okay, guys, this is really critical. So listen up. You've submitted your three letters of rec, two academic, one professional, two academic, one extracurricular, whatever the combination was. Now you got waitlisted, right? Or deferred. And maybe you want to submit one more letter of rec as a way of helping kind of push you over that edge. Now, all schools are going to ask for this. In fact, most won't. But if you get the opportunity to do it, and the school is not saying don't do it, then get a letter of recommendation from a current student or an alumni
Mhm.
of that school. Why? Because those schools, I mean, those letters, even though they're Hail Marys, they go and they say, hey, look, Tyler, you graduate Carnegie Mellon. And
Mhm.
Tyler says, hey, I know John very well. We have worked on 1, 2, and 3, or we were in class, whatever it is. And I've been to Carnegie Mellon, and I can say safely that John would be a perfect fit.
Mhm.
It just adds an extra layer, and it just gives a school that feeling like, great. If this guy is vouching for this person, that's kind of what we look for. And as an alum or a current student, that's very, very important. It could be instrumental. And I can tell you guys, when I applied to law school, that's what I did. I was waitlisted at a couple of schools, and I was on the fence in a couple of schools. And one of the schools, I got someone I knew who was an alum, actually a current student, excuse me, a second or third year student, wrote a letter of rec, and that really, I'm almost confident, pushed me over the edge, and get me into that school. So it's a really good, how do I say it, hack if you can pull that off.
Yeah, so I'm curious. I really like that one, and that's one I haven't heard before. I'm curious if you're waitlisted and you don't have any friends who are currently a student or an alumni, would it be helpful to get like another academic one or another extracurricular one? Is it still
Yeah.
helpful to send something?
Yeah, 100%. I think it is. So I gave you guys a hack in terms of a current student alumni because they can say and that only goes to that school, right? It's not going to go to every school. It only goes to that school that you got waitlisted at. But if you got waitlisted, yeah, I don't see why not, unless the school says, hey, you're waitlisted. Do not send me anything else. We will let you know if you're off the wait list. Okay, well then you have no option. But if they
Right.
come back and say, is there anything else you'd like to submit to your application, right, to supplement it, then I would definitely look for a letter of recommendation. That that Tyler adds to the other letters of recommendation, not repeats and duplicates, but adds to it another layer of who you are, right?
Hmm.
And I think that's going to be very, very important in terms of the whole process. So they could, and not only adds to, but if there's one that, let's say you applied in September, October, and you get that fourth letter somewhere in March, April, if they can write about what you've been doing since and that they can attest to, that's also kind of a home run there. They can say,
Hmm.
we've been working with this individual for the last 3 or 5 months. They've been fantastic, 1, 2, 3, or whatever it would be.
Yeah, I also am curious. That reminds me of sort of just a general broader question. When you're looking for your recommender, is it better for it to be somebody that worked with you recently or someone that knew you really well? And I know that it's kind of subjective, but it's like, let's say your JV soccer coach was like a
Mm.
huge champion for you, but now you're on varsity. Like, what do you think that like just having a better, brighter, happier letter is more important than someone who's worked with you recently? Or I mean, is this too case by case to answer, or is it kind of like there's a golden rule, like always try to pick stuff that's from the last year or something like that?
It's a great question. And I have to say that the JV example of a sports example I would have to say that is not going to be as strong as a more recent one for the extracurricular slot.
Hmm.
Here's where there's a difference. If you got a letter of recommendation from a professor during your sophomore year or sophomore year of high school, you got a letter of recommendation, and then another letter of recommendation from an academic from your senior year or junior year, I guess senior year because you're applying. Well, no, I guess junior year, especially the second part of junior year. Then I think that's where that could work because what the sophomore year will say was the person has achieved this much by this period. Then the
Right.
second letter will complement it and take it to the present day. That's important. And since you get two bites at the apple with academic, that's where you can show progress. And schools love that. But I wouldn't take the slot of a JV coach that talks about you in freshman or sophomore year, because what happens if by end of junior year you drop whatever and you suck at it and you're not great and your sportsmanship, your teamwork, has just waned significantly, then it's going to hurt it. But academic improvement is important. Extracurricular, I'll try to keep it as up to date as possible.
Cool. And then the other thing I wanted to ask about is, who are the people not to ask? I think that we already kind of touched on like if it's Al Gore or something, but they don't know you, it's not really going to help. But are there other people that just like you generally should try to? It seems like a good idea, but it's actually not.
Well, so I've kind of thought about like there's three of those types that you don't want to ask. And one of them being the VIP over someone who knows you well. So you've got the Al Gore example. Sorry, Al Gore, this is not personal at all. I didn't vote
Thanks
for
for
you in
inventing the
2000.
internet.
Yeah, I didn't vote for you in 2000. I'm an idiot. I take, I regret it, but it is what it is. Um, the other one is don't ask someone who you're not 100% sure will have your back, because that's an important one. We talked about a cheerleader, right? But if you're kind of like, oh, that history professor, they like me, but I'm not 100% sure. One of the things you could do is, and we're going to talk about best practices, is you go talk to them, suss them out, see how they feel about you, right? Before you pull the trigger and say, write me one. And frankly, Taylor, I actually don't know the answer to this. What happens if a recommender writes a recommendation for you, submits the recommendation, and then you start getting cold feet that that recommendation is not going to be a good one? Can you go online and delete that letter of recommendation from the Common App aggregator in terms of
Not
uploading
sure.
it? I'm not sure either. That's a good question. I asked our
My guess would
audience.
be no, right?
I don't know. That just seems unfair to me where somebody writes a letter and then you're like, wait a second, I don't know. And then say, please delete it. I'm going to upload another one in their stead. And you still have time before the application is finalized. I don't see why you couldn't do that to shop for letters. Audience, help us. Respond to us. Respond to us in the show notes. But I'm curious to know because it could be a case by case basis. But it is important to kind of think about because you want to make sure that whoever you trust has your back will write the recommendation in a way that you expect, not someone who's going to be a mixed bag. And if you're not 100% sure, do not go to them because if they do write a bad one, it could definitely, I'm not going to say torpedo your chances, but if it's pretty bad, it could do that. And the school would probably put a lot of weight on it. The last person I would say don't ask is don't ask family, don't ask friends. We talked about friends because they may be co-equals, and the school will see that as not having the kind of veracity that you would want. Family being the same. Obviously, family will be biased inherently, and so you don't want to have that as a letter of recommendation. Now, people are going to come back to me and say, "But wait a second, I'm working with my dad or my uncle. That's the only internship I got. Can we not have a letter of recommendation for them?" I would say no. If there's anybody else in the company that was slightly your supervisor or in any capacity higher than your standing in the company, have them write it. But do not have your father and so forth. Some people have come back to me and said, but my uncle has a different last name. You know, take your chances. They may
Yeah.
ask the recommender, like, in what capacity do you know in this individual? And if the person writes, I worked with them, and they never reveal that they're your uncle, well, you just got away with it. But typically, be on your guard not to ask for family, not to ask for friends, because it does hurt the veracity, the objectivity of the letter itself.
By the way, doing a little Googling in the background, with the Common App, you can, if you invite somebody to recommend you and write a recommendation letter, you can rescind that invitation before they submit it, but after they submit it, you cannot. So once
Boom.
that letter is submitted, you are stuck. And
Thank
I
you,
mean,
my friend.
yeah, and I
Thank
also
you.
think that that's like, that leads to a really, like, I really like that piece of advice, though. Instead of going to a professor or going to your coach and being like, hey, I really want you to write me a letter of recommendation, maybe go to them first and be like, hey, how would you feel about writing me a letter of recommendation, right? Like, just like take their temperature. And like, even if they really like you, they may not be super enthusiastic about it in a way that maybe you don't want to pick them.
Yeah, or you first start the conversation with, "I'm applying to college. I want to kind of pick your brain."
Right.
See how open they are about them just talking about their experience and what advice they have for you. Then say, I'm currently looking to see get letters of recommendation, and I was thinking that if you would be interested. Oh, I'm a little busy. Amazing. Talk about a temperature check, run for the hills. Oh, yeah, I guess. Okay, put them in the lukewarm pile. Oh, I would be honored. Run with that one because that's the kind of vibe that you want to get with the recommender. Um, and again, to answer that, we thank you for looking that up, Tyler. I don't know if that's the case with school specific who are not part of Common App. It
Hmm.
could be on a case by case with other schools.
Yeah.
Common App probably wants to keep it pretty airtight because they're trying to streamline everything. They don't want somebody to keep firing up like 20 different letters of recommendation and deleting and uploading it. So they're, from a policy perspective, they're just like, you got a chance.
Hmm.
You can rescind after you've sent them the link. They haven't uploaded it, but which I don't, how do you do that?
It's all in the Common App UI. Yeah, they have like a whole UI for letters of recommendation, and they basically what you do is you give a name and an email,
Yeah.
and Common App sends the email directly to the recommender. You're not supposed to be in the process at all, other than like inviting them in the first place.
Right, but I'm thinking of like, okay, so if you invited them, you send they received an email from Common App, they haven't submitted a letter yet. How do you rescind unless you email the person and say, hey, please actually don't submit anything? Is there a way that you can delete their name and email off the UI so that when they go on to press send, it just gives them an error message of some sort?
Yeah, that's exactly it. In the
Okay.
Common App UI, they have like a little screen, and you can delete the people. There's a little trash can
Okay, good.
icon.
Well, there you go. Somebody must have been through this scenario before, and that's why
Yeah,
they kind
yeah.
of put that into there. So I think let's get to like some best practices. We just gave you a great
Yes.
one. What a hack. What a hack. I'm glad that we thought about that. I had not given that too much thought because I would imagine if you do your diligence, you get the temperature check, you talk to them beforehand, then you don't have to be in this scenario. Um, but if you are in that scenario, there's your answer. Um, so first thing I would do in terms of best practices is a short list of recommenders. We've already talked to you about the qualities that we want. So you keep that as your lens. Then start shortlisting it and create a list of maybe 6 or 8 people that you potentially would have. Bulk up on the academic, then extracurricular, then you've got your kind of X factor, your professional, your mentors, your current alum, all that kind of stuff, right? Then once you've shortlisted that group, so you have your 8, let's say, then narrow that down to like your top 5 pick. You've got your 3 core and 2 alternates. The 3 core are the ones that now you feel comfortable. You've maybe done a temperature check and you've gone to them and say, hey, will you write me a letter of rec? And they were all thumbs up. Okay. And they passed the accessibility test, right? They
Hmm.
were going to be accessible. 2 weeks before, you're still not getting them to confirm that they've submitted their letter of rec. Jump back into the platform exactly like Tyler just looked for you. If they're not responding, if they haven't submitted it, I mean, now you're really getting close. Delete, go to the alternate, and press play. And you can even talk to the alternate and say, listen, I would love you to write a recommendation for me. And they could, and again, now it's so much more technical. So they could write it. I don't know if they're going to be upset that they write it and they hold on to it until you send them a link. And then they'd get peeved if you don't. I guess what you could do is you could have them write it. You don't send them a link yet. They're in a holding pattern and they could be number 4 and you never send them the link if you don't need them. And then if you got waitlisted, you go back to them and say, hey, I now need the opportunity for you to submit that letter. Or you tell the alternate in so many words, I have certain people I need to get recommendations from. I do want to keep you on hold in case I need an additional letter or in case one of them falls through, especially if you have a good relationship with them and they'll be like, sure, come back to me anytime. That would be the ideal scenario.
Yeah, I mean, I would definitely lean in the direction of just telling the truth in this case, right? Like, because I think that the thing you don't want to do is like potentially sour the relationship with this person, and then the time comes that you do actually need their letter. Like, if you get waitlisted, but you've already kind of made them annoyed because you asked them to do this work and then didn't use it, right? So I think at least for me, I would say tell them the truth. Basically, like you don't want to be like, hey, you're my fourth choice, but maybe like you said, Hamada, you put it like, hey, like I have to get one from like these academic people, and I have to get one like just say it's Hamada's fault. Say, my counselor or the people that I'm working with, They told me I have to get one from my coach and two from my professors. But we've run the robotics club together for the last year, and I would really love to have you be my fourth one in case one of them falls through or in case I get waitlisted. Like, would you be open to that? I think that as long as you just kind of don't make it personal, it should probably go okay.
I think so. I think that's exactly the point. And I think people would be okay with that either way. If they're got your back, they're willing to do whatever it takes to help push you in that positive direction, whether they are your primary recommenders or alternates. And
Hmm.
their goal is to try to help you push you across the goal line. And so we spoke about temperature checks. You could use it. You can use the next piece of advice is used for both temperature checks and once you've solidified that this person is in fact going to write you a letter of recommendation. And that is speak with them directly. Don't just email, hey, Tyler, can you write me a recommendation? I'd be honored if you did. Sure, I'll write you a letter of recommendation. Leave it at that. No, you want to basically
Wouldn't even
provide the
ask over email at all. I mean, I don't know, maybe I'm old school, but I would definitely ask in person.
and that's exactly the point. Don't email the recommender for recommendation. Try to find a way to approach them. If they're not too busy, and ask them directly. Go to their office hours. See if you can kind of find them on campus. Talk to them. Have a conversation because what you want to do is you've got the temperature check that you're doing with them. B, once you've got the temperature check and they're going to be your go-to person, you want to. I old school as well, Tyler. I actually would print out my resume, print out my transcripts to that point, and even print out like my Common App essay if I've already completed
Yep.
it, and then put that into a folder and say, here you go, here's who I am. And we'll talk a little bit about this in terms of what is called a brag sheet. It's commonly known as, you have all that, you put it to the folder, you give it to them. So now when the recommender is actually putting your recommendation together, they've got these great tools that they can kind of reference back rather than trying to scratch your head, remember who you are. And you're making their life easy.
Yeah, you're making your life easy. And the other thing I really like about that is that it keeps the story together. I mean, one of the biggest things that is kind of the challenge with letters of recommendation in general is that they might vary wildly from what your overall story is, right? Like in general, your application is best if you can kind of through your essays, letters, etc., have a cohesive narrative. And if you don't provide some evidence of that narrative, then the recommender could write anything, right? And it's
Exactly.
not to say that they have to follow the narrative, right? You can't control what they do at all,
Exactly.
but you can definitely like make it clear what you're looking for, and hopefully, if they like you, they'll take that into account.
Exactly. And that's how you want to kind of approach that. And speaking with them on so many levels, triggers memory of who you are. They see how you present yourself. They see how professional you are. And that really gives them a good feeling when they put the recommendation together. I did that when I was applying to college, when I was applying to law school and so forth. And I thought it made such a big difference from that perspective. Um, the other thing in terms of best practices is thinking about the letters of recommendation are meant to focus on two main areas, right? IQ, EQ. And again, EQ, emotional quotient, one of the most important factors that schools look for now, as much as IQ in terms of your intellect. And you want to make sure that the letters of recommendation, the two or three you submit, provide a healthy balance of both. You don't want to be in a position where you have two letters of recommendation, both academic, both leaning very heavily into your IQ, and then neglecting your EQ,
Right.
and vice versa. So you want to make sure that you have healthy doses of both represented in the different letters that you have.
Yeah, because the schools both, I mean, I'm sure that Harvard's fine with what happened with Mark Zuckerberg, but like, the Zuckerberg-esque like genius that also is a lot of people kind of dislike, like is not actually what their preference is. They'd rather have kind of the genius that also everybody likes. Just all other things equal.
Exactly. The well-rounded, the person, because look, in the end of the day, you get a genius who's completely out of touch with how to communicate. You're going to have a lot of breakdowns, class discussions, empathy, open, frank, interactions. it really doesn't is not conducive for a safe space in an
Right.
academic environment when you're around people who do not know how to communicate well, are not sensitive enough to other people's narratives or curious enough to learn more about them. And that's why emotional intelligence is so important. And look, reality speaking, Tyler, like obviously you and I wouldn't be in the business we are if we didn't have a semblance of emotional intelligence. But in real life, you got to have it. It's impossible. We no longer live in a world, I would imagine, I hope not, I hope it never happens, where we're just plugged into a room, shut the door, put the red stapler on the desk, and close the door after us, and nobody communicates with us. Like we're people that are communicative still until AI, consumes us. That's more important than just your intelligence.
I mean, I think that when AI suddenly starts doing a bunch of the work, the EQ will become even more important because it'll be the one thing that differentiates us.
No,
Um,
100%.
but yeah, not to be, and I mean, the proof is in the pudding too. Like, for instance, I mean, because I slandered Mark Zuckerberg without, well, he doesn't
Again,
care.
we're gonna get in trouble.
No, he actually, you'll notice in the last like 5 years or so, he's really, you can see in the what he's doing that he's really working on his EQ. So,
Yep.
it's important to everyone.
Exactly. And that's I mean that's how we I heard him. It's funny you mentioned Mark Zuckerberg. He was the commencement speaker at Harvard when I graduated,
Oh, wow,
and
cool.
and his whole speech was really kind of almost like he was doing, I think, what they call like a bellwether to see how people would receive him as a potential politician, because he recognized that he can't just be the guy who's kind of stuck in the room. And how they uh, showed him on television with that Social Network movie where he looked like a complete recluse and so forth. He really tried to show like all his different facets, and that's something that's very important to him now that we see a lot of these tech giants grapple with and have a lot of difficulty with, without mentioning the new move for Twitter and so forth, and what's going on with our friend up there who's
Yeah,
leading the charge
yeah.
on that.
People are assigning different levels of importance to this. Without getting too far off topic here, I think just it would actually be helpful for IQ. I think it's pretty clear when you're getting an academic letter of recommendation and it's talking about IQ. It's like, Tyler was one of the top students I've ever taught. I mean, that's also like a language thing that I've heard a couple of times doing other episodes. Like, you don't want them to say like Tyler was a good student. You want them to say like Tyler's one of the best students I've taught in the last 10 years or whatever. Like try to give some award or context or perspective on
Yeah,
like you know like in over the course of their career or whatever it is.
exactly.
But with the academic stuff it's kind of straightforward, right? Like it's like, okay, like they were good at the stuff, they showed intellectual curiosity. But for EQ, like how would a recommender talk about your EQ in a good way?
So if you were focusing on the academic part, one of the best ways to do that is in class participation. They were
Hmm.
good listeners. They were gracious speakers. We saw them communicate with other people on projects. Um, their delivery, their ability to answer questions. That kind of interaction, I think, is going to be very important. How they volunteer to take assignments, right? That kind of shows the EQ from an academic in class situation. Outside the classroom, it should be fairly obvious, right, Tyler? Because you're talking about like how well did they communicate with other team members if it's an extracurricular? How well did they play with people? What kind of sportsmen were they? All that kind of stuff comes into the EQ aspect of it. But the academic one is harder because, like you said, it's much easier to say they performed well in this project, they crushed their midterm, they killed their final, right? That's where you have to really show in class collaboration, participation, listening skills, giving people space. I guess, what is it? Stand back and listen, not always speak up.
Hmm.
So these are, I think, the important aspects of how you can kind of really showcase one's EQ from an academic perspective.
Great. And so yeah, then moving on from that, I feel like you talked about a lot of these different ways that you can kind of prep your recommenders, right? So I
Yeah.
mean, there's like the brag sheet, and what is in the brag sheet? You probably don't want to say that you're like platinum elo in League of Legends or whatever it is.
No, you don't want to do that unless the class is all about actually creating games, which would be pretty cool. But the idea here is that your brag sheet should be bulleted making the life of your recommender easy. I told you submit your transcripts, resume, and potential draft of your Common App essay to the recommender. A brag sheet kind of is in lieu of or in addition to those. It may be duplicative, but the idea here is that you just kind of provide a summation. So you say, look, I was in your class, I participated in this way, and you want to make sure you're honest about it and you're objective about it. These are the projects I worked on. This is the paper I submitted. This was the title. This is the grade I received. On outside of the classroom, here's what I've been doing in high school, focusing on these things, the student paper, the robotics club, whatever it would be. And my goal is that I want to basically in college study X major and eventually go on to do Y field, right? And then you provide that to them, and it's kind of like a summation of your life with all the flowers, with all the beauty. Don't be overly hyperbolic, but definitely, you want to ingratiate yourself. With accurate information, and you present that to them. They can then peruse that quickly and then have the right snippets to then tuck inside it's as if it's like Inception, like the movie. You guys seen it? It's like as if you plant the seed of those comments and compliments in the brag sheet that they would then assume they've written it themselves or thought about it themselves, and then subconsciously pile that into your recommendation letter.
Right.
And that's the closest you're going to get to basically orchestrating your letter of recommendation, because you can't write it yourself. So this would be one of the closer ways of doing it, and it's fair game because you're just providing them with notes for them to think about, and no school is going to reprimand you for that. And within that, let me add also is examples. Always back your compliments of yourself or your brag sheet with examples. Say, I was definitely one of the top performers in the class in terms of my grades. Here are my grades. Here is X. I was someone that, I felt I provided a lot of space in class. Here is an example of a class that I did that with whatever. I mean, try to flower it up with examples so that, again, the recommender can pull that example, own it, use it to kind of showcase your strengths, your skills, your qualities as well.
Should you be at all worried about recommenders taking the same example, or does it not really matter?
If the recommenders all using the same example?
Yeah, or just
Yeah.
two using the same example.
No, and that's where you want your brag sheet. It's not going to be copy paste the same brag sheet. You've got to kind of tweak it and have some of the stuff in the brag sheet should be different from one recommender to the next. So what they do is both letters are not duplicative, but complementary to who you are.
Got it. Okay.
That's very important. So that, again, when the letters don't look like, oh, that's the same exact letter, I wonder why. In some cases, when that happens, it's because you wrote it twice. Obviously, that's not the case. It's because you gave them a brag sheet that had the same information, so they just pretty much use the same stuff. From our perspective, don't have a brag sheet that talks about one side of you, another one that talks about the other side of you, not one that's completely comprehensive that they both use, because you don't know if they're going to, like you said, use the same example. Make sure, another good best practice is make sure that you got the correct email address of the recommender and one that they check often, because you don't want to be in a position of giving them an email of, let's say, an old email that they don't check, and when you're emailing them or Common App is emailing them, it's going into their spam. They never look at it. So you want to make sure that you're getting them the most up-to-date contact information that you've worked with and checked yourself. Like you've corresponded with the person, they've used that contact information. As I said, waive the right to review. Don't look at your letter. Okay? I'm not going to say anything more. I'm going to leave it at that. Don't look at the letter, because if the school says, did you opt to look at your letter of recommendation? Or I guess the way it's phrased, Tyler, correct me if I'm wrong, either it's, have you looked at your letter of recommendation? Yes or no? Or do you waive your right? Actually, that's what it is. Do you waive your right to look at your recommendation letter? Yes, I do waive my right to look at it. And the idea is that you do not want to look at it, because once you do, they will think that you've influenced the letter unduly, which will in fact impact its credibility. Last two quick points, guys. One is go and request the letter in advance, which is what we talked about. Develop your short list, as soon as possible, and then start going into the temperature check, reaching out to them, temperature check, talk to them, and make sure that you've given them plenty of time, because I think it's be honest, I've written quite a few letters of rec myself for past employees and so on and so forth. And I find it somewhat disrespectful of my time when they give me a couple of days to do it. Because it shows me they don't care about my time. B, it shows that I'm a plan B, and that they've already asked somebody else and they didn't come through, so now they're coming to me, which doesn't give me a lot of cause for comfort. So I would say at least 2 to 3 months out, start approaching it, test the waters, get the temperature check, and get the ball rolling, and follow up with them. Like 2 weeks out, hey, just want to double check that you sent it. And if it's the Common App, correct me if I'm wrong, Tyler, you will see that it was submitted in the
Hmm.
Common App that says in a recommendation letter submitted. So you'll know you're good to go,
Hmm.
right? But you could always follow up and say, hey, I saw that you submitted my letter of recommendation to the Common App. Thank you very much.
Hmm.
That will then trigger them, because what happens, Tyler, this is random, that they submitted a draft. They submitted the wrong one. They submitted Tyler's instead of David's, Bob's instead of Sarah's, right? So then they'll quickly remember, oh yeah, let me quickly double check. He prompted me to take a look at it. They go back to the Common App. They see they submitted the right one, right?
Well, and also, I mean, I can't imagine how many people ask for letters of recommendation, the professors do it, and then they never hear from the kid again, right? Like just saying thank you is already going to help you stand out for that person, and they'll be more willing to help you in the future.
100%. And that's my last point, and you pretty much got it, is thank them after they've submitted the letter. Thank you for submitting the letter of rec. And then send them a thank you once you got admitted. Hey, Professor X, just want to let you know I got into Carnegie Mellon. I'm so happy. This is exactly where I wanted to be. And a lot of thanks goes to you for having written the letter of recommendation. I hope we stay in touch in the future. I very much value your support and your guidance. Have a great summer, or whatever it is. It really will give them a lot of feeling of how do I say it, of just appreciation. I
Hmm.
think it's very, very important to do that.
Yeah, that sounds good. And then anything else that you want to just like talk about as we wrap this up?
No, I mean, look, again, I can't emphasize enough that your application that you're submitting needs to be multifaceted in the fact that it shows all aspects of who you are.
Hmm.
So do not overlean on one area versus another. So whether it's your essays, you want to vary them and speak about different experiences and examples in different essays that holistically show a great image of who you are. By the same
Hmm.
token, the same with the letters of recommendation. Don't have the recommenders all hyper focus on one achievement or one aspect of who you are. Each letter should showcase different aspects: EQ, IQ, your personal qualities, your future goals, whatever it is, right? And so that when the school looks at all three letters of rec or both letters of rec, they get a very good overview of who you are as a candidate rather than just one facet. So I'll just leave you guys with that parting thought.
Yeah, thank you so much. This has been Shift, a college admissions podcast for a changing world, hosted by Tyler from Achievable with Hamada from Right Track Admissions, and that's WRITE. Get a free trial of Achievable's ACT course by going to achievable.me and use the code podcast to get 10% off at checkout if you like it.